Good afternoon. My name is Eileen Bolger, and I am the chair of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma. One of the greatest honors of serving as the chair of the COT is the opportunity to introduce the Scudder Order at Clinical Congress. Recognizing the need to improve the quality of care for injured patients, in 1922, Dr. Charles Scudder convened a group of 26 surgeons to come to agreement on a standardized approach to the treatment of fractures. He was subsequently appointed as the chair of the ACS Committee on Fractures, which evolved into the Committee on Trauma. Through the development of the regional committee structure, the standards that he developed for the essential care of fractures were widely adopted across the United States. In 1929, Dr. Scudder gave the first oration on fractures at the Clinical Congress, and this tradition continues today in honor of his legacy. Selection as a Scudder Order is one of the greatest honors conferred in trauma surgery. The criteria for selection include demonstration of sustained commitment to trauma care, significant contributions to improving care, and a voice for ardent advocacy for high professional standards. Today, I am honored to introduce to you Dr. Gregory Jerome Jurkovich, who clearly embodies the traits set forth by the legacy of Dr. Scudder. Dr. Djrkovic was born and raised in Minnesota. He obtained his undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering from Northwestern University, followed by his medical degree at the University of Minnesota. He went on to complete his residency in general surgery at the University of Colorado, including a 2-year research fellowship at Duke. His professional career spans 4 distinguished institutions. He began as an assistant professor and director of the trauma services at the University of South Alabama. In 1988, he joined the faculty at the University of Washington, where he served for 26 years, rising through the ranks to professor and chief of trauma at Harborview Medical Center. In 2012, he became the director of surgery and trauma at Denver Health and the vice chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Colorado. Currently, Dr. Djrkovic is the vice chairman for clinical affairs and quality at UC Davis. Dr. Djrkovic has made major contributions across our field, including groundbreaking research in trauma system development, quality improvement, and injury prevention through the development of alcohol screening and brief intervention, which is now a requirement for all ACS verified trauma centers. His current work on the screening and intervention for post-traumatic stress disorder will likely follow a similar path. He has contributed to over 370 peer-reviewed publications and 130 book chapters. Dr. Jurkovich has been a leader in our professional societies, including serving as the president of the Western Trauma Association in 1996, vice chair of the Committee on Trauma from 2002 to 2006, president of the AAST in 2008, and chair of the National Trauma Institute and the Coalition for National Trauma Research for the past 5 years. During his tenure in the leadership of the AAST, Dr. Djrkovic led the Acute Care Surgery Committee, spending countless hours reimagining our field, developing a messaging strategy and a training paradigm for which there are now 28 AAST-approved acute care surgery fellowships. Amidst all these accomplishments, Dr. Jurkovich has emphasized the importance of keeping the patient at the center of our work. During his presidential address at the Western Trauma Association, he relayed his experience as a patient, himself battling lymphoma. And he reminded us of the importance of seeing our patient's perspective. He wrote, "We ignore our patient's subtle yet clear calls for guidance, for understanding, for emotional support. We treat the broken bones, but not the emotional disturbance that results from the car crash that cost a father his life and forever scarred 2 families. It is not enough to care for our patients. We must care about our patients." In summary, Dr. Djrkovic has been an incredible mentor and role model to a generation of trauma surgeons. I owe him a personal thanks for introducing me to the work of the COT in Washington State, for guiding me through my first research project in trauma care, and supporting me throughout my career. He has managed to do all of this with the support of his wonderful wife, Dee, and 3 amazing daughters, Jessica, Allison, and Chelsea. Please welcome, with a virtual round of applause, your 2020 Scudder Order, Dr. Jerry Jurkovich. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bulger, for that very kind and personal introduction. We have been friends and colleagues for many years, and having you introduce me is a special place in my heart, so thank you. And my thanks also to the Committee on Trauma for the honor of this oration. I am, of course, fully aware of the historical significance of this lecture and humbled to be included with the list of past honorees. It is, as you might imagine, anxiety-provoking to be given this platform, and as such, I prepared my remarks with the greatest of respect and admiration for the American College of Surgeons and its legacy, for all my colleagues in surgery, and in particular, for those of you in our chosen career as trauma surgeons. I must acknowledge the profound influence others have had on me, allowing me or any Scudder Order this special honor. My past and my influences are deeply rooted in my family, the faith we were all raised with, the legacy of immigrants and education as a priority, a true family physician as a member of our family, and the sacrifices it takes to get there. My father died a few years ago, and I miss him daily, as much as a reminder of what it takes to be a man with a family as for any other number of reasons. My mother is a sparkly 89 years young, but unfortunately a bit of a technological Luddite, so I will have to show her this talk later. My 3 brothers and I are close, best friends really, and part of a much larger network of family that brings both identity and grounding. My education and training legacy is a source of great pride for me, as are the notable figures who have populated that journey. Northwestern and the University of Minnesota set the stage, the University of Colorado and Denver Health, research fellowships at Duke, and then jobs at the University of South Alabama, Washington, and now my home in Sacramento at UC Davis. I once had a dream to live in all 4 corners of the regions of the country, and this journey has nearly afforded me that reward. I must call out a few, of course, at the risk of missing many. I nearly became a transplant surgeon because of the influence of John Najarian and Tom Starzl. I gravitated to the field of trauma and acute care surgery because of the influence and mentorship during my residency of Ben Eisman and Gene Moore. And I flourished in this field because of the surgical leaders spawned by G. Tom Shires, namely Bill Carreri, Jim Carrico, and Ron Mayer. I found my professional home at Harborview in Seattle, where I was blessed with wonderful friends and partners and a community that simply suited me and rewarded me. Part of that reward was the amazing academic cross-department affiliations with many notable figures, including Fred Rivara, a pediatrician and current editor-in-chief of JAMA Open, Ellen McKenzie, an epidemiologist and dean of the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, Doug Zatzik, a psychiatrist at the University of Washington, and Avery Nathans, a consummate academic surgeon now in Toronto, who many of you know as leading the TQIP initiative, but to me represents a long line of the immensely successful fellows we had at Harborview, who are always a joy to work with. 2 chairs have particularly influenced me, Carlos Pellegrini and Diana Farmer. Quite different people, but both consummate academic surgeons, kind, thoughtful, and honest leaders with other qualities too numerous to name that reflect the best of all of us. To be sure, I have loved the friendship and family so many on this slide have blessed me with over the years in academic trauma and acute care surgery. The sharing of our hobbies outside the hospital setting has been wonderful. It is my true wish and hope that all of you can find the same strong sense of belonging. And I cannot thank you enough for the friendship, the collaboration, the laughter, and the discussions on the philosophy of life. Now, past orators have covered a wide variety of topics in the field of trauma surgery, and I hope I will call some of them to mind during my presentation. But I feel I must begin today with some comments on the most unusual situation we find ourselves in this year in the midst of a pandemic infecting 30 million people worldwide, causing over 1 million deaths and sparing no corner of the world. As this next slide runs, I hope you will see the increase in volume of the COVID epidemic and its deaths in the world. The sheer volume of information about the epidemiology, the clinical course, and the biology of this virus is at once breathtaking and overwhelming. Enough, we scream almost daily, with the onslaught of input on the pandemic, the social woes, political polar objectives, historical and deadly fires in the West and hurricanes in the South and East, and other disasters. And that abbreviated list only represents the American aneurysm of pain and skirts the global problems of pollution, waste, overpopulation, famine, and armed conflicts. And as this graphic would suggest, we are not yet over this deadly worldwide pathologic disease that has now dwarfed other healthcare problems. It has struck within our own circle, of course, and likely those close to you. The illness of one of the world's foremost transplant surgeons in New York represents one of many in our circle. And as is the frequent advice from our own college, the deluge of academic articles from throughout the world, they all serve to emphasize the deadly nature of this disease. To be honest, of course, surgeons are not at the forefront of this pandemic, other than providing invaluable support with ECMO. But we certainly have our roles that continue, particularly in trauma centers across the world. Unfortunately, as an editorial by Michaels and Wagner pointed out this past month in JAMA, the United States is facing an unprecedented, massive healthcare worker crisis, with thousands of us exposed to the virus as we provide care to others. Estimates of more than 150,000 hospital and nursing home staff have been infected with COVID, and more than 700 have died. But OSHA has simply, unequivocally, failed in its responsibility to even accurately track these numbers. And so, I am not comfortable with this. Are you? To me, it is an amazing fact of biology that a virus, biologically known as SARS-CoV-2, can have such a profound effect on virtually all aspects of contemporary life. The coronaviruses are a large family of enveloped, non-segmented, single-stranded RNA viruses that circulate among animals, including camels, cats, and bats. Coronaviruses derive their name from the electron microscopic image shown here, which resembles a crown or corona. They have one strand of RNA and with it 4 structural proteins: a spike protein, the envelope protein, a membrane, and a nucleocapsid. The single-strand RNA consists of nearly 30,000 nucleotides. 1/3 are genes for building the 4 structural proteins, and the rest are for replication, with the exception of 8 specific genes for proteins that inhibit host defense. 8. The viron attaches to human cells via the spike protein and via the human angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor. The viron releases RNA into the cells, where it is replicated at a rate of 100 to 1,000 new virons per cell per day. 6 strains of the coronavirus have now infected humans, 4 of which together are responsible for many of the common colds. And while the virus is small, it can be filtered by the appropriate mask. Those of you who live in the West will recognize the size of smoke fire pollution at 2.5 microns and other industrial smog at 10 microns. Yet mask wearing is not universal. Social distancing is ignored. Parties and the modern day Roman Colosseum of college and professional sports must go on, and so the spread continues. Now with over 200,000 deaths in the United States, and yet another current curve spike in progress in many parts of our country. But as is human nature, there must be some humor in this darkness. And so the memes and cartoons lampooning 2020 and the lifestyle it has destined for us are numerous. I hope you can see here some of my favorites. Many states and communities have been able to bend the curve of the infection rate, allowing hospitals to adapt to the unprecedented onslaught of those with the most severe form of this respiratory illness. But as a society, our attention to this advice and warnings wanes. As this graphic from my own hospital shows, 2 spikes in admission and positive test rates, one early in March, one again in July, and almost certainly a fall season spike about to happen. The predictions regarding these spikes were spot on. It is, after all, simply math and biology. We have had warnings about the lethality of pandemics. In the past 2 decades, there have been other global epidemics, 2 in particular, the SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, in 2003, beginning in China, likely from bats, civets, and raccoon dogs, and spread by people. It had an R0 of 4, meaning 1 person infects 4 others, and a case fatality rate of 10%. The second warning was MERS-CoV, causing the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. It began in Saudi Arabia, spread by camels and people. The MERS syndrome had a very high case fatality rate of 35%, but a very low R0 of 1, meaning it would be difficult to eradicate, but it will not cause a pandemic. As best known of SARS-CoV-2, the virus, or COVID-19, the disease, this has an overall case fatality rate of 3% in both the US and worldwide, but it may be as high as 10% in some countries. Its infectivity, or R0, is best estimated to be a distressing 5.7, but good data has been difficult to determine, and it has shown to range from 1.3 to 7.1 in 3 different studies. So here we are as trauma surgeons, exposed to a large number of patients every day from every walk of life and at the highest risk of getting infected. I don't want to be infected. I don't want to infect my family. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to be a vector, and I certainly don't want to die. I am not comfortable with any of this, but how can we just walk away? Who is comfortable in today's trauma centers? The conflict of this perspective has been captured in an essay in the New England Journal of Medicine by a young internal medicine resident. Written during the spring of the pandemic and capturing the montage of opinions and suggestions for slowing the spread of the virus. I love the line, and I quote, "After 22 years of education to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, after finally grasping a basic understanding of the sodium balance and the management of hyponatremia, after all this work, will I be undone by a savage single-stranded piece of RNA?" Indeed, the essayist goes on to say, "I am not immunocompromised. I am not pregnant. I am not chronically ill or elderly. In the absence of these conditions, does my profession now demand that I embark on a fearless, unwavering sense of duty? But I don't want to be a tragic hero. I didn't sign up for that." Essentially saying, I am not comfortable with this. But like this author, we have found a way to manage these anxieties, these fears, the guilt, and we bob along through the flood of information of the pandemic. Some will try to find a profound meaning in this anxiety, but most will simply try to survive one step in front of the other. This pandemic has reminded us all of our responsibility as physicians and healers, and brings home the common theme of medical school applicants saying, quote, "I want to help people," as justification for entry into our profession. Lisa Rosenbaum, the well-known correspondent for New England Journal of Medicine, has written with severe angst about the heroes that will shelter in place, including herself. Acknowledging her lupus and immunosuppressive therapy, and following the pleading of her mother and the admonition of her family, she stepped aside. As she beautifully writes, and I quote, "Clinicians on the sidelines must confront not only shame and guilt, but also the loss of their primordial story. Who are you if you can't be the hero you imagined yourself to be?" Howard Buckner, editor of JAMA, recently commented that 2020 will be a transformative year of the 21st century. Like 1776, 1865, 1941, all of the 60s, and 2001, it will be a year that will be written about taught in school, and become part of the collective memory of the people who lived through it. It has already reached into our vernacular, our common vernacular, in the response to the simple greeting of, "Hi, how are you?" To which I can relate to the answer, "I am 2020, meaning I'm lonely, depressed, isolated, angry, anxious, on edge, thankful, grateful, worried, unsure, unsettled, restless, and bored, all at the same time." Now, the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant is widely considered the central figure in modern philosophy. He wrote of the need for societies to have, quote, "the moral law within," that without a common sense of what is right or just, groups will fracture and the fragments will wander and the basis for society will be lost. Our chosen field of medicine is defined by the sense that we are committed to promoting the science and art of medicine and improving the health of the patient. Within the background of the tumultuous events of 2020, we are forced to acknowledge that the traditional lane of medicine must be much wider and must encompass our role in the fabric of society. As Don Berwick noted recently in JAMA, healers are called to heal. When the fabric of communities upon which health depends is torn, then healers are called to mend it. The moral law within insists so. So then, within that context, where does the phrase, "I am not comfortable with this," fall? How many times have you answered a transfer center call from a sending provider from another hospital with the statement, "Our surgeons are not comfortable taking care of this patient"? Or how many times has your emergency room tried to find an admitting physician for a patient and heard the response, "No, not my service, I'm not comfortable with that," and use this as grounds for transferring the patient to yet another hospital or another service with family dislocation and patient expenses ignored? Who is comfortable in 2020? And where did this phrase come from? What does it mean? Where does it fit in our role as physicians? Did Halsted, Cushing, or Osler ever utter this phrase? Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this phrase taking hold in the clinics, the hospital corridors, and the halls of medicine. It seems that whenever confronted with the challenging, the inconvenient, the undesirable, the uninsured, or maybe just overwhelmed with a newfound anxiety, our colleagues and peers have begun to utter the phrase, "I am not comfortable with this." Jack Salvant, a neurosurgeon in Virginia, penned a piece on this topic last year in the social media that caught my eye. It made me realize I was not the only one peeved by this statement. As Dr. Salvant noted, upon utterance of this simple line, all responsibility to the patient or the honorable practice of medicine is immediately and completely absolved, and the responsibility and burden, however large or small, must come to rest on somebody else. The phrase, "I am not comfortable with this," has become so powerful that it leaves no room for question. Instead, the phrase explaining the lack of ability, the lack of knowledge or training, we now deftly wield this phrase and produce an impenetrable shield against all that is unwanted, all that is difficult, all that is unpleasant or just inconvenient. It absolves responsibility. Of course, this is not a shield raised only by physicians. It is a perfect defense for anyone who is stressed, burnt out, or doesn't wish to be bothered with a difficult problem or additional work. It is now heard from nurses to the super specialists who, perhaps, may be using it as a way to avoid caring for the most challenging, common, and least rewarding conditions in medical practice, at least at night, weekends, and in the uninsured. Now, perhaps saying this phrase is just a matter of practicing defensive medicine. Defensive medicine may motivate doctors to request more consults to limit liability and responsibility, referring to different specialists for each symptom, with the thought that once a referral is made, responsibility is pardoned. Difficult patients are placed on a referral merry-go-round, seeing one specialist after another without any clear, concise plan of treatment. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is the primary driver of this ubiquitous phrase, but it might be a component. Perhaps the use of this phrase is a demand or expectation for perfectionism, or a fear of making an error, or even succumbing to the demand of some patients that if a super specialist exists in this area, then that care must be sought out. Every symptom must be assigned to a specialty, and a consultation must be obtained for every item on the problem list. The hospitalist or emergency room physician, or indeed the modern acute care surgeon, becomes little more than a triage specialist. It is little wonder medical care has become so disjointed and expensive. Can it be that no one is comfortable anymore, and the net effect has been the insidious growth of apathy among doctors? This may be our professional example of the behavior science known as risk aversion. Dr. Collins, Shin, and Hanley, congenital heart surgeons, writing an op-ed in the Annals of Surgery recently, celebrated the risk-taking and innovation by intrepid surgeons in the development of congenital heart surgery. But they likewise decried the loss of risk-taking by hospitals and doctors brought on by grading systems and rankings and spilling over into surgeons avoiding risk-taking to maintain the status quo and their excellent scorecards. They argue convincingly that this will eventuate in the loss of skills, loss of innovation, and eventually the loss of lives. Marlene Gagné and Ed Deasy, two well-known Canadian and American psychologists who have largely defined motivation and education theory, posit that there are three pillars that support a professional's intrinsic motivation and well-being, namely autonomy, competence, and a sense of belonging. Many have argued that these three have been stripped away as a direct result of the restructuring of the modern healthcare system. Perhaps this phrase, "I am not comfortable with this," is a direct result of the loss of these three pillars. Are we no longer autonomous? Are we no longer competent? Can we no longer relate to a system or feel like we belong or have a personal attachment to our patients or our workplace? Doctors used to want to give their patients the time and the support they needed, and they wanted the system to value and recognize their efforts to provide this kind of care. While much lip service is given to the phrase patient-centered care, many doctors feel that the system is increasingly driven by money and metrics, with rewards for those who embrace those priorities rather than the patient-doctor relationship. Well, I am not comfortable with that. To be sure, there have always been physicians who have found a way of avoiding extra work and unpleasant patients, but the change we are experiencing today is much more widespread, in my opinion. Examples abound in the creation of boutique medical practices that are, in essence, simpler and more profitable. We bandy about the descriptor of a, quote, more balanced lifestyle, but at times that simply seems as code for an easier job. And when all physicians opt for easier, we surely have a problem. And perhaps that is what we're seeing. Perhaps medicine is now simply a job, no longer a profession, no longer a calling. Karl Hauser expounded on this risk in his most eloquent Western trauma presidential address in 2017 entitled Ownership. In that address, he outlined the corporatization of healthcare and the loss of medicine as a profession honored and loved by the public and idealized in the heroic images of Ben Casey, Kildare, and even Hawkeye Pierce. Dr. Hauser argued that physicians have been forced to change. Medicine was once a bastion for humanism, and surgery a bastion for charismatic individuality and creativity. Of course, like anyone mulling change, there is a nostalgia for the way things were, and oftentimes an overlooking to some degree of what was bad. But do you look back on your time in training and your entry into medicine practice with horror or with affection? The enormous humanism of those experiences has been replaced by bland corporate conformity and a profound lack of personality. It is now work, a job, no more than that. Our demeanor and personality is now narrowly defined in the name of professional behavior, codified under the mantra of compliance performance, and, as Karl says, enforced by the corporate cudgel of HR. So maybe that is the reason for the phrase, I am not comfortable with this. Perhaps it is a combination of, I don't want to do it, I don't need to do it, and it's not my job. Gagné and Deci would say we have lost our intrinsic motivation and well-being. Or maybe it's simply the truth. Maybe we no longer are competent and trained to be able to take care of many simple healthcare problems. But are we as a profession comfortable with that? Is this phrase really simply a way of saying, I don't know how to take care of that problem? I was not trained to take care of that problem. I don't have the confidence it takes to take care of that problem. Evidence that this might be the case can be found in the plethora of publications that decry the incomplete preparation of the general surgery resident and the onslaught of fellowship training in narrowly focused fields. Some have called this a crisis of autonomy, from Greek autos and nomos, essentially self-governing, or one of the pillars of motivation and well-being. The drive to be the origin of one's behavior and to exercise free will in choosing one's goals. As this applies to surgeons, this translates into the ability to provide quality care in and out of the operating room without any hand-holding oversight. And so how autonomous are our new graduates? One recent paper shown here from the Procedural Learning and Safety Collaboration measured the readiness of chief residents to function independently, called with supervision only. They had a large sample pool, a well-validated measuring tool, and focused on what we would generally classify as straightforward and common procedures. Can the results of this be true? Are only 1/3 of chief residents ready for practice? Well, this is supported by our own college's move to develop a transition to practice program, in large part to prepare general surgery residents to function autonomously. It is also true that most fellowship program directors do not find graduating chief residents prepared to function autonomously, as illustrated in this paper from the American Surgical. Program directors of the Fellowship Council were queried. 21% felt that new fellows were unprepared for the operating room. 38% demonstrated a lack of patient ownership. 30% could not autonomously perform a lap chole, and 66% were deemed unable to operate unsupervised for 30 minutes or more. The major qualitative data revealed deficits in the domains of operative autonomy, progressive responsibility, longitudinal follow-up, and scholarly focus. It is no wonder that 80% of graduating general surgery residents go on to do a fellowship. In this classic report from Heather Yao, the American Board of Surgery, and Dick Bell, virtually every categorical resident responded. It was part of the in-service exam. While many were indeed concerned about their own ability to operate autonomously, a strong majority felt that they must be trained in specialty surgery to be successful, to be competitive, and to have the lifestyle that they want. So what exactly is it that drives this push to specialty training? It is clear there are patient issues and demands, with our own bulletin suggesting patients will prefer a specialist if they have a choice. Perhaps this is also driven by volume performance data, the incessant scoring of doctors and hospitals, the advertising by big pharma and by doctors themselves. But the patients are also saying that doctors are less caring, less professional, less available, and more of a service provider than a professional. The idealized version of the physician of the last 100 years is certainly changing. The net result, of course, is the salami slicing of surgery. But this is not just true of surgery, it is true of all fields of medicine. And while there are many drivers of this tsunami of specialization and the resultant reluctance to provide care for anyone outside of that narrow focus, I submit there are three main drivers affecting us now. First of all, the application pool is quite different than it was at any time in the past 100 years, with new surgeons expecting different things from a career in medicine. I am, however, hopeful of the many qualities of the millennials, those now in medical school and early residency, For they have the characteristics of being civic-minded with a strong sense of social consciousness and environmental awareness. They recognize global citizenry, and they are entrepreneurial. I have great hope for them, as should you, for they are our future. They are our hope. Second, while training work hours certainly are more humanely limited, it comes with unintended consequences, including the loss of ownership, frequent handoffs, the loss of missed rare special clinical opportunities, and of course, the loss of autonomy. Now, these could be fixed by simply allowing chief residents in the surgical fields to bill for Medicare and Medicaid. Or perhaps it could be fixed with enforceable and valid milestones in training progress. But neither of these seems evident, and it's clear we have work to do in this area. But lastly, mostly, the trend to specialization is, I think, because of us, the mentors and the educators. For the vast majority of surgical teachers are today super specialists. And the number one and number two driver of career choices for today's mentors, for today's trainees, are their mentors and their lifestyle. I am not comfortable with this. For where does this leave us, the trauma and acute care surgeons of the 21st century? Halstead thought that every hospital of any merit should have at least one surgeon who could operate on any patient, any problem, and care for the sickest of all. Many Scudder orators, including the Detroit icon Alexander Walt, have argued that the trauma surgeon must be that complete surgeon. In his 1978 Scudder address, Dr. Walt centered on the thesis that no surgeon has a greater need of a broad and rigorous training than those who declare themselves to be trauma surgeons. He admonished that the increase in scientific knowledge was no justification for a diminution in our range of interest as we pass into practice. Dr. Walt wrote and spoke eloquently, and I suspect he would be aghast by the use of the phrase, "I am not comfortable with this," from any of his colleagues. He recognized the frightening fracturing of patient care with these words, quote, "The injured patient propelled past a stellar array of super specialists without the services of a galactical surgical pilot may be needlessly lost in eternal darkness." What if we, trauma and acute care surgeons of now and tomorrow, started saying, "I am not comfortable with this," as we encountered a new patient in the ED, or began asking for someone else to take responsibility for the care? One might argue or imagine many changes in medicine and surgery that might alter this seemingly inevitable outcome of salami slicing, depersonalization, deprofessionalization, and surgery. Here are a few. Perhaps general surgery training programs must exist in isolation without any specialty fellowships in the same institution. Or perhaps more rural or large town hospitals should have general surgery training programs. Perhaps EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, should be changed to alter the ready transfer of any medical problem to a hospital with supposedly more specialty resources. Perhaps funding of medical care should change to discourage the plethora of consults and their fee for service. I'm sure you in the audience will, of course, have your own ideas and dreams and fantasies on this solution. But I would like to propose one more that I believe we have the most control over, the most reasonable possibility of changing, and that is the enhanced training paradigm of acute care surgery. As originally proposed, this 2-year post-general surgery fellowship would incorporate surgical critical care, trauma and emergency general surgery, and bolstered, enhanced training in the management of vascular, hepatobiliary, and thoracic issues. We must return to this model. The convenience of having a pretending fellow who simply functions as an additional person to take call, with minimal or no direct education or help or expert assistance, is all too common for most of the second year of this fellowship. And I think we can and we must do better than that. To be sure, time on the key non-trauma clinical services and exposure to patients with vascular, thoracic, and hepatobiliary issues has been severely hampered by our specialty colleagues in those areas, denying our fellows access to those cases, typically under the defense of having to train their, quote, own fellow. This must stop. We must find a way to train acute care surgery fellows so that they are comfortable with the broad array of surgical diseases that populate their consult list. We must make this happen if we are to remain the galactical pilots or the complete surgeon, or even the one last group of surgeons who will not say, I am not comfortable with that. I want to conclude by thanking my partners at UC Davis for never saying I am not comfortable with this. They are a great group to work with. They manage an incredible spectrum of injury and disease, and with a love for their work and appreciation of their role in the fabric of our community and our profession. And finally, I want to acknowledge my own family for their love and support throughout my career. My 3 daughters continue to teach me much about what it takes to be a man and a father. And finally, my wife and partner in all of this, Deanne. It has been a great journey. Onward.